Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to deal with the aftermath of the shooting in the church, returning to that LA Times article, quote, "Down at base camp, a handful of actors were preparing for their scenes that afternoon. Through the window of his trailer, one performer heard a crew member receive an urgent-sounding message over the walkie-talkie. There's been an incident. We called 911. Now, that is another aspect to bear in mind, is that besides cell phones, SMSs, text, social media, there was also the correspondence, the communication taking place over the walkie-talkie. That, unfortunately, is something that is going to be available to us only through what witnesses say. But on the other hand, something spoken over walkie-talkie is something that is often widely known on a set. And so the dialogue on the walkie-talkie, I think, is also an important aspect that hasn't really been dealt with. Returning to that LA Times article, quote, "Still the actor wasn't especially concerned. There was typically an overabundance of caution on movie sets." And this is the part to highlight. "A production assistant asked the talent to remain in their trailers. Don't take any photos. Don't text your friends. Let's keep this contained," the staff advised. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I think this is a very important point. Who made this statement? Don't text your friends. Let's keep this contained, right? It was the production assistant. Which production assistant? The point is, it is someone who is part of the production staff, someone who is part of that producer quota of the crew, right? And so what they're already trying to do is control the narrative. Does that make sense? And so I think one of the questions one's got to ask is, hasn't that been going on since October 21st? Controlling the narrative, influencing the narrative, right? Now, the other thing is, many of the crew knew within the first 10 minutes what had happened. Let me say that again. Not just one or two, many of the crew knew within the first 10 minutes what had happened. And I want to contrast this with what Alec Baldwin said on ABC News in early December, where he said something like, none of us had any idea kind of what had happened, or words to that effect. None of us knew that it could have been a live round until the police officer showed them, right? And so it kind of rubbishes this idea that anybody speculated or anybody put two and two together and came to the obvious conclusion. Does that make sense? And so now let's go back to the LA Times article, quote, "But after about 10 minutes, the actors started getting restless. Some walked to the doors of their trailers to confer with one another. 2 people got shot. How, what the F?" Right? And so this is relaying the actual dialogue between actors verbatim. They knew that 2 people got shot right in the beginning, within 10 minutes, as any normal person would have known. You heard a shot ring out. Someone was rehearsing with a weapon. So it was pretty obvious, wasn't it? Going back to the article, quote, 2 ambulances arrived around 2:08 p.m. And that is also quite fast. If you think about, the 911 call was made shortly before 10 to 2. So it took less than 20 minutes for 2 ambulances to arrive. I think the 911 call was made at 1:46 and the ambulances arrived at 2:08 p.m. The LA Times describes these ambulances passing through rusting white ranch gates onto unpaved dirt and gravel roads. And at this point, these emergency vehicles had to slow down to about 20 miles per hour. And so this would obviously have delayed them getting there, but they still got there reasonably quickly. And you might also remember from the ABC News interview, Alec Baldwin saying that he felt like the authorities/EMS, but whoever was called to the scene, he felt that they took quite a long time. And in a situation like that, you could say, you could argue, you could have a defense case where you're saying Helena died because the authorities took too long to respond. In other words, the responsibility shifts from the perpetrator to the emergency medical services. Do you think that's believable? Do you think that's credible? Do you think that is reasonable?
I went up to her and then we were told to get out of the building. We were forced to get out of the building. The medics came in. I mean, I stood over her for 60 seconds and she just lay there kind of in shock.
Was she conscious?
My recollection is yes.
So what's quite interesting from that response from Alec Baldwin is that he admits, using quite stilted language there, that Helena was conscious. She was actually talking. She was actually still alive. She was bleeding. She was injured. But she was obviously able to answer questions. I mean, she lived for several more hours. And so this idea that it was the super urgent situation where they had to get out of the building immediately, well, it took the ambulances 20 minutes to arrive. It took the medics, would have taken them quite a long time to arrive as well. Not 20 minutes, but certainly a while. And so this idea that you couldn't even talk to her is, I think, a little bit of a stretch, perhaps.
When she went down, he went down, and he was screaming really loudly. And I thought, what is he screaming? What happened? Within 15 minutes or 20 minutes after that, the police arrived and took the church set and put the crime tape around it, the yellow tape, and forced us all to the perimeters of the parking area where we sat and waited. She was in the church, and she was not taken out of the church for quite a while.
So what is interesting is Alec Baldwin doesn't actually mention the ambulances arriving and when they arrived. He does talk about them being inside for quite a while. And there's a reason for that. When someone is losing blood, you can't just simply transfer them. You need to first, the priority there needs to be to staunch the blood flow, to keep them in place and to make sure that the bleeding stops. Does that make sense? The other thing to note is that the helicopter began hovering over the ranch at 2:15 p.m. That is just 7 minutes after both ambulances arrived. That is also pretty damn quickly. And so I don't think you can fault the emergency medical services in terms of the number of them and the resources that were made available. There was certainly enough personnel on hand to treat Helena and Joel. And so according to the article, just as Suze's ambulance prepared to depart for St. Vincent Regional Medical Center in Santa Fe, that was when the helicopter started hovering. So as the one ambulance was leaving, the helicopter arrived. And I think that's the other point to establish is that by around about 2:15, the first ambulance had already left. So the one ambulance arrived, well, let's put it this way. The one ambulance arrived at 2:08 and left 7 minutes later with Joel Souza. The other ambulance waited, and during that period, the helicopter arrived. And I think during that period, they were really struggling to stop, to attend to the serious wounds. You can imagine the wounds to Elena were a lot more serious than to Joel. And obviously we know that she didn't survive it. And so it's at this point, at 2:15, when the one ambulance leaves and the other emergency medical services are on the scene and the police are on the scene, that the gravity of the situation is starting to descend onto people. According to the article, quote, a crew member who'd left to run an errand was stopped at the front gate as she tried to drive back onto the ranch. And she was told the following, it's quite interesting, quote, nobody's allowed to go up there except the police officers and the ambulances. Someone from the transport department, I think of the crew, told her this. And she couldn't believe it. She thought, you've got to be joking. And they said, no, someone has been shot. And so even someone at the gate knew exactly what had happened. So I think the crucial bit of information is that the helicopter stayed on the ground until 2:50 p.m., right? So it had been there for around about 35 minutes. And it did seem like a long time to the actor, according to the article. I think the actor that is being referenced here, although not named, is Alec Baldwin. That it seemed like it took a long time to actually treat Helena. And so there was kind of a feeling, how bad could the injury be if the helicopter was on the ground for more than half an hour? In other words, there was this perception that if the helicopter had landed there and nothing was really happening, well, probably it wasn't that bad. Maybe they were going to even let Helena go. In fact, it was the opposite situation. They were dealing with a critically wounded person, and they were trying to stop the sort of downhill slide of her condition worsening. So do you agree that what was going on here was that EMS were trying to staunch the flow of blood, right? Going back to the article, quote, back at Bonanza Creek Ranch, Baldwin and about a dozen others sat on the back of a 5-ton truck awaiting their interviews with police who were inside a 4 saloon. Down at base camp, people were spooked but attempting to remain calm. Trained to comfort with food, a craft services assistant began to pass out homemade trail mix. And then here's this timestamp. Around 3:30, Baldwin returned to base camp. He had changed out of his costume and was wearing his street clothes. That's also very important. What prompted him to change his clothes? Was it something he was asked to do? Was he told to do this? Was why? How and why did he elect to do this? And if you think about it, he changed into his normal street clothes within an hour of this taking place. I think from the description, from the timestamp, relatively early in the afternoon, it would seem that he changed out of his costume prior to meeting with the police. And I'm talking about meeting with the police where you see those photos of him very late in the afternoon in those changed clothes, right? And so the question really is, did the authorities ask him to change, or did he do it out of his own volition? And I think there's quite a big difference between those things. And then he also said, quote, I've never been handed a live weapon ever. And this is what the actor told his peers. It's not clear if this is Alec Baldwin or some other actor. The person's not known, but he's just saying, I've never been handed a live weapon. And all these other people circled around him. And no one there tried to console him because no one there knew just how bad the accident had been. And so that's quite interesting, is you had Hannah crying or very disconsolate, whereas you had others who don't seem to know what's going on, and so they don't need to be consoled. And one sort of wonders, was that intentional, not allowing certain members of the crew to know exactly what was going on then and there? So that is another important question, I think, to address, and that brings us to media strategy. And we are going to be dealing with these questions, the most important questions, in the next episode. In terms of the media strategy, at roughly 5:30 p.m., production asked the remaining crew members who had driven themselves to set to form a long line with their cars and exit the ranch en masse. They wanted everybody, they'd arranged for everybody to kind of exit at the same time. And the reason for this was to confuse and to make it harder for the media to talk to anybody. According to the article, quote, a few local newspaper reporters had gathered on the set, and driving out altogether would make it more difficult for the media to reach anyone. Why didn't the producers want any of their crew talking to the media? Had the producers expressly ordered the crew not to talk to the media? And yet Baldwin himself would, at length, a few weeks later, in early December. Is this controlling the narrative? Is this about influencing the narrative? What do you think? So I'm not going to take it further than that. I will be going back to the affidavit from Hannah Gutierrez-Reed to juxtapose what you've just gone through here in terms of the law enforcement response. We're also going to be dealing with the actual script for the church scene. So look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.